Once upon a time, the land was considered sacred, and native peoples of North America viewed themselves as children of the Wakantankin, the Great Spirit that created all living things, the Sioux. Among the main tribes that inhabited the Great Plains region stood out for their social structure and bravery in combat. The Sioux ancestors reached the forest of north-central Minnesota and northwestern Wisconsin from the Mississippi River shortly before 800 AD. By 1300 AD, they had embraced the hallmarks of a tribal society and became known as the Seven Council Fires. The Sioux made up a confederation of several tribes that spoke three different dialects: the Lakota dialect, the Dakota dialect, and the Nakota dialect. The Lakota consisted of 7 tribal groups and were the largest of the 3 groups occupying land in South and North Dakota. The Dakota lived mainly in Minnesota and Nebraska, while the smallest of the 3 groups, the Nakota, resided mostly in South Dakota, North Dakota, and Montana. The Sioux were a prideful people with a rich heritage. They were rulers of North American plains and grasslands, feared by other tribes from the Great Lakes region to the Rocky Mountains. They settled in western Minnesota, establishing a nomadic lifestyle on the plains. They used horses extensively, animals originally brought to the Americans by the Spanish in the 16th century. Their main source of food was buffalo meat. To assist in the buffalo hunt, the Sioux lived in tents that allowed them to move quickly and keep up with the annual migration of buffalo herds. While the Sioux were known as great warriors, the family was seen as the center of Sioux life. Children were called with cancer, which meant sacred being, and they were the center of their care. While monogamy was most practiced, Sioux men could marry more than one wife if he proved able to support them. The male and female roles were clearly defined, with men responsible for supporting and defending the family. Hunting was very seriously regarded, and infractions of hunting rules could lead to the offender suffering the razziing of his tent or other property. The Sioux were deeply attached to spiritual practices. They believed the nature's sacred spirits brought visions and prophecies to help guide human actions. Religious dancing was common among the Sioux, and self-sacrificed rituals, inflicting wounds on themselves, affirmed their identity as warriors. This was also carried out as a sign of mourning for the death of a close relative or tribal chief. One common belief among Sioux communities is that the spirit of the deceased would travel to an afterlife. In traditional beliefs, this spiritual journey was widely believed to begin as soon as funeral procedures were complete, which took 4 days. The grieving family and friends would attend that 4-day wig to follow the spirit to its final resting place. War was another core Sioux principle. Men built their prestige through war, and warfare was reflected in their family. His honor. The warriors were called Akachitas, and they mainly fought on horseback, having their main weapons bows and arrows, spears, and hatchets. The Sioux Dakota entered an alliance with the French merchants at the end of the 17th century. The French were attempting to gain an advantage in the struggle for the North American fur trade against the English. The first reported encounter between the Sioux and the French occurred when explorers and traders Radisson and Descroziers reached what is now Wisconsin during the winter of 1660. There was another indigenous group that traded with Europeans, the Ojibwe, who inhabited southern Canada's Great Lakes region. The Ojibwe were remarkable for their large population and expansionist tendencies, which led to conflict with neighboring tribes. Sioux started to resent the Ojibwe trade with the French and other rival tribes such as the Cree and Assiniboine. Tensions escalated in the 1720s and led to a drawn-out war. In 1736, the Dakota Sioux lost their traditional lands around Leech Lake and Millilocks when they were forced south along the Mississippi River as a result of the battles. These conflicts within the tribes were also dangerous for European traders. Regardless of which side they traded with, they were seen as enemies by the other. Still, trade with the French continued until the latter gave up on North America in 1763. The Europeans repeatedly attempted to create a truce between the warring tribes to protect their interests, but with limited success as the United States developed into a nation. The American colonization of new lands became more frequent. The Sioux had many of their lands raided, and several peace treaties and negotiations were made, and breached railways hired poachers in the 19th century to exterminate the buffalo herds to force the tribes onto reservations, as the buffalo almost quickly became extinct. Both the Dakota and Lakota were forced to accept reservations set by the Americans in return for the rest of their land. Domestic cattle and corn were given to the Sioux in exchange for buffalo, making the Sioux dependent on the government for access to their basic food. The United States aimed for the treaties to encourage the Sioux to convert their nomadic hunting lifestyle to sedentary farming as done by Europeans and Americans. By 1858, the Dakota Sioux had only a small patch of land along the Minnesota River with no access to their traditional hunting grounds. They had to rely on treaty payoffs for their survival, often delayed the enforced lifestyle change, and vastly underpayments from the federal government wreaked financial hardship and increased social strains within the tribes. By 1862, many Sioux were famished, and tensions peaked in the 1862 Dakota War. The first major showdown occurred in 1854 near Fort Laramie in Wyoming, where 19 American soldiers were killed in retaliation. American troops killed about 100 Sioux at their camp in Nebraska in 1855 and arrested their chief in 1866. The Red Cloud's War was fought and ultimately ended in a treaty that granted the region known as the Black Hills in perpetuity to the Sioux. But the treaty was not honored by the United States. In the 1870s, gold miners swarmed into the region, helpless and with no hope for a better fortune. The Sioux and other tribes formed the largest Indian camp ever seen by white men. Around 10,000 Indians, divided between men and women and children, tried to subsist in a place inadequate for all. The families, tired of the incessant harassment and violent retaliation, two tribal chiefs, the famous Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, managed to get the support of Sioux warriors and their allies. This led to a series of Indian attacks on cattle ranches and small towns owned by the American colonists. The American government appointed Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer under the command of the 7th Cavalry Regiment of the United States Army to fight the Sioux and suppress the Indian attacks. Custer was known and hated by the Indians of several tribes. Already he had a habit of attacking Indian camps when the warriors were absent and then murdered women and children. The ensuing fight became known as the Battle of Little Bighorn and went down in the history of the American West Conquest. The Battle of Little Bighorn took place on June 25, 1876. The fight was a crushing victory for the Lakota Sioux and their northern Cheyenne and Arapaho allies. The 7th Cavalry, a force of 700 men, suffered a major defeat. 5 of the 12 companies on the 7th Cavalry were wiped out, and Custer was killed, as were 2 of his brothers. A nephew and a brother-in-law. Custer's body was found with 2 bullet wounds, one in his left chest and one in his left temple. Either wound would have been fatal, even though he appeared to have only bled from his chest wound. Some scholars believe that his head wound could have been caused after death. It is possible that upon receiving a gunshot wound, Custer committed suicide to avoid capture and subsequent torture. After this battle, the Sioux split into multiple groups. The American troops' massacre of an estimated 150 to 370 Sioux men, women, and children in December 1890 heralded the end of the Sioux resistance against the American army. Throughout the 20th and 21st century, Sioux descendants had continued to find courts for the right to remain in their homelands. They had asked for compensation for the abuses and crimes committed by American troops in the past. As of 2018, compensation totaled over $1 billion. However, the Sioux declined payment, demanding the return of their land. Today, the Sioux uphold many separate tribal governments scattered across several reservations in North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Minnesota, and Montana the Sioux are living a modernized lifestyle that bears scant resemblance to their ancient nomadic ways, but the fact they are part of one of the most powerful and outrageous of the North American native nations still remains a source of pride and dignity for their descendants centuries before the arrival of Europeans in the Americas. North America was inhabited by countless indigenous tribes, most of who led a semi-nomadic lifestyle, roaming from one region to another in quest of new hunting grounds and gathering fruits and roots. Over time, however, population growth led to conflicts between the tribes for the best hunting grounds, which often ended in violent battles. Nevertheless, even at such a distant time, democracy had already taken root in North America. Known as the Iroquois Confederacy, this League of Nations emerged among the 5 tribes of the northeastern forest that have been tormented by retaliatory wars and violence for many generations. The Iroquois originally lived near Lake Ontario and along the Mohawk River in New York State around 1605 tribes. The Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca came together to form a confederation. A 6th tribe, the Tuscarora, joined in 1722. There were other tribes that spoke in a similar language but were not part of the confederation. In 1650, the Iroquois started making their way to the state of Ohio between the Great Lakes and the Ohio River. They conquered and chased out several groups of Native Americans living in the area. Resulting conflicts were known as the Beaver Wars, as the Iroquois wanted more land to hunt and capture beavers and deer. While the tribes began to work together, they surely did not renounce war. They fought and captured other native tribes as well as waves of European immigrants arriving on the new continent. They fought against the early French and British settlers. The Iroquois took part in the fur trade with the Dutch and then the British. Unlike many other tribes east of the Mississippi River, the Iroquois generally disliked the French and usually traded their hunting spoils with the English. A small group converted to Catholicism and helped the French, but the majority of the Iroquois helped the English during the so-called French and Indian War. As was fairly typical of northeastern Indians before colonization, the Iroquois dwelled in large communal houses known as molocos, made of saplings and covered with elm bark, each sheltering many families. The Moloka family was the basic unit of traditional Iroquois society and provided a form of social organization. Agriculture was the main food source, and the woman had a specific role as they were thought to be connected to the land's power to generate life. For this reason, women were responsible for determining how food would be distributed within the community. Iroquois society was matrilineal. When a marriage took place, the groom and his family relocated to the bride's home, and the family line was traced back to her. War was important in Iroquois society, for men's self-respect depended on achieving personal glory, and war prisoners of war were often enslaved or otherwise adopted to replace dead family members. Battle losses and disease heightened the need for prisoners, who became a significant population in Iroquois settlements. By the late 17th century, during the American Revolution, the Iroquois sought to stay neutral. First pushed to join one side or the other, some tribes such as the Tuscarora and the Oneida sided with the colonists, while the Mohawk and Seneca remained loyal to Britain, with whom they had stronger relations. In 1779, George Washington commandeered the Sullivan Expedition, led by Colonel Daniel Brodhead and General John Sullivan, against the Iroquois nations to not only invade but to destroy the British Indian alliance. They torched many Iroquois villages throughout western New York, and the surviving Indians moved to Canada. The American Revolution bred great division among the colonists that also caused a rupture in the Iroquois Confederacy. The diseases brought by the Europeans dwindled the Iroquois population to a fraction of what it had been in the past. Hundreds of years of coexistence between the tribes and the collective government were superseded by the sheer immensity of the American Revolutionary War. By the end of the war, the fear that the colonists would fail to honor the pleas of the Iroquois became a reality, especially after the majority decided to stand with the British and were no longer considered reliable by the newly independent Americans. The Canadian Iroquois communities in Oka and Kanawiki became flourishing settlements in the 19th century, supporting themselves by farming and selling sleds, snowshoes, boats, and baskets. Iroquois society would prove to be the most persistent military threat that European settlers could face, though the conquering of their territories forced them to relinquish much of their land. Their legacy remains. Some historians assign some aspects of the United States Constitution to the Iroquois ideas. The Iroquois Confederacy laid out a model of federalism, separation of powers, and participatory democracy that would inspire leaders such as Benjamin Franklin and James Madison during the formation of the United States. The Navajo were one of the major indigenous nations of North America. They mainly inhabited the southwestern United States, which today includes the states of Arizona, New Mexico, and adjacent portions of California, Colorado, Nevada, Oklahoma, Texas, and Utah. The Navajo are believed to have initially migrated from western Canada, where they belonged to a group of Native Americans called the Athabascans. According to researchers, some Athabascan groups arrived in the American Southwest around the year 1300 of the Common Era. Some Athabascans settled in southern Arizona and New Mexico, making up the different Apache and Navajo tribes. The Navajos' religious beliefs claimed that their origins stemmed from 3 underground worlds and that they traveled through these using different colors, black, blue, and yellow, until they reached the luminous world, where they emerged in the La Plata Mountains in southwestern Colorado. For the Navajo, the gods created the 4 sacred mountains, Blanca Peak and Hesperus Peak in Colorado, Mount Taylor in New Mexico, and the San Francisco Peaks in Arizona. These were supernatural boundaries within which everything was safe and secure. In addition, the gods also established 4 rivers which acted as defensive gatekeepers. One of these was the San Juan, which played an important role in some of the Navajo myths and acted as a demarcation line in the Navajo territories. The Navajos' interactions with other indigenous peoples, such as the Pueblo tribe of the southwestern United States, were recorded in the 17th century. At that time, refugees from the Pueblos joined the Navajo following the Spanish suppression of the 1680 Pueblo revolt. The rebellion temporarily pushed the Spanish back into Mexico, but in 1693 the Spanish reconquered the Rio Grande Valley area. The Spanish arrival also brought new livestock to the Navajos, such as sheep, goats, and horses. The Navajo were highly adaptable and included domestic animal husbandry and agriculture in their subsistence system. They also adopted horses and, like other tribes, used them as a means of transportation or as mounts in battle. The artistic influences of the Pueblos led the Navajo people to adopt painted pottery, and weaving rugs made by the Navajo are particularly delicate examples of their art. Another important Navajo artistic tradition was the creation of silver jewelry, probably learned from Mexican blacksmiths. The Navajo learned everything they could from other peoples and used this in their society. This adaptability allowed the Navajo to become the largest and most widespread tribe in the Southwest. Although the Navajo fought bravely to defend their territories against the Spanish, Mexican, and American invaders, they cannot be considered a warrior tribe regardless of their bravery. Their lack of political integrity was always an obstacle to military organization. They never had a defined tribal chief, and their many leaders never commanded more than a small number of followers. Manolito, elected chief in 1855 at the conference with Governor Meriwether to negotiate a treaty, probably had more followers than any other Navajo in historical times. With their vast population, the American subjugation of the Southwest would have been much more difficult than it was if the Navajo had the insatiable bellicose urge of the Apache. In 1864, thousands of Navajos surrendered to American soldiers and made the long walk to Fort Sumner, New Mexico, where they lived on a reservation. Under horrific conditions, the Navajo Reservation was established with the signing of the 1868 treaty when they were finally allowed to return to their homeland. Since then, the Navajo Reservation has expanded significantly to 27,000 square miles. During World War II, the Navajo played a very important role within the American troops at the Battle of Iwo Jima. American Major Howard Connor, a signal officer with the 5th Marine Division, stated if it wasn't for the Navajo, the Marines would never have conquered Iwo Jima. Connor had 6 Navajo code talkers working around the clock for the first 2 days of the battle. These 6 Navajos sent and received over 800 messages, all without error. Navajo coders took part in every U.S. Marine assault in the Pacific between 1942 and 1945. They served in the 6th Marine Divisions, Marine battalions, and Marine parachute units, broadcasting messages by telephone and radio in their native language, a code the Japanese could never break to understand the attack. Coordinates. Today, the Navajo Nation has the largest land area held by a Native American tribe in the USA. Unlike many tribes, the Navajo has managed to keep their cultural heritage alive. Over 97% of the adults still speak the Navajo language, and many members of the nation speak fluent English. Some continue to practice ancient religious and ceremonial forms, preserving the glorious history of the Navajo people. The region known as the Great Plains, stretching east of the Rocky Mountains in the United States and Canada, has been home to many different Indian tribes, with each of its own particularities and traditions. Among the different North American tribes, the Comanche Nation was one of the most active and powerful. They inhabited the territories that today comprise of north-central Texas, eastern New Mexico, southeastern Colorado, southwestern Kansas, and western Oklahoma. The Spanish colonizers called the historic territory the Comancheria. Originally, the Comanches were part of a group of tribes known as the Eastern Shoshone, who lived mainly in the Wyoming region and shared the same language and customs. The Shoshone kept a very similar lifestyle to that of the ancient hunters and gatherers of prehistoric times, living as nomads and without notable military might. This was bound to change with the arrival of the Spanish conquistadors. Around the year 1500, the Europeans had brought firearms, and particularly horses, to the American continent, which brought great changes to the culture of the native peoples. The command of horses gave the Comanche tactical superiority against other neighboring tribes that did not yet have these animals. The Comanche split from the Shoshone with about 10,000 members. They first migrated to the Central Plains before proceeding south to an area that stretched from the Arkansas River to central Texas. As they continue to migrate, the Comanche population increased dramatically due to the plentiful buffalo. Thanks to the horses, yet again, they could be hunted down more easily and become the Comanches' primary source of food. As their population grew and a war-based culture developed, the Comanche soon became the most feared warriors in the territory. They were renowned for their savagery and combat and their great skill as horsemen. They were also dreaded for their habit of kidnapping people and mistreating them in a very cruel way, considering their captives as slaves or commodities to be exchanged for furs and horses. The Comanche fought against the Apache and pushed them out of the plains. By the end of the 18th century, the struggle between Comanche and Apache had taken on legendary proportions. In 1784, the governor of Texas, Domingo Cabello, wrote that the Apaches had been defeated on the southern plains in a battle that lasted 9 days somewhere in northwestern Texas. The Comanche Indians often resorted to night raids against their enemies as a tactic. This was usually on full moon nights when visibility was better, allowing the Comanche to see their routes. This led to the English term Comanche moon, when the Comanche would attack to capture horses, hostages, and weapons. Unlike other indigenous lineages, such as the Cheyenne and Arapaho, the Comanche never constituted a political unit recognized by all members, they instead divided themselves into self-sufficient tribes, pursuing their economic and political goals. Sharing the same language and culture, they sometimes fought amongst themselves, and other times they were at peace working together. In the 19th century, they became involved in stealing cattle from settlers in Texas, reselling them in New Mexico. They fought against the Mexicans and European settlers and many of the other Plains tribes during this period, having ruled the area of Texas, including northwestern Oklahoma and northeastern New Mexico. The Comanche were so successful in the art of horse taming that they started supplying horses to French and American traders. During the 19th century, the traditional Comanche burial practice was to wrap the body of the deceased in a blanket and lay it on a horse behind the rider. He would then ride off to find a suitable burial place, such as a safe cave. After the burial, the rider would return to the camp where the bereaved relatives would burn all the deceased belongings. This custom lasted until Christian missionaries coaxed the Comanche to bury their dead in coffins and cemeteries. Also during the 19th century, the Comanche managed to maintain their independence and even increased their territory. Soon, however, this area of prosperity would be greatly affected by a wave of epidemics due to Eurasian diseases for which the Comanche had no immunity, such as smallpox and measles. Smallpox and cholera outbreaks occurred between 1817 and 1849, had a major impact on the Comanche, whose population dropped from about 20,000 to only 7,000 in the 1860s. The efforts to move the Comanche to a reservation in the Oklahoma Indian Territory began. The American government provided them with churches, schools, and annuities in exchange for a vast expensive land totaling more than 60,000 square miles. The Americans also promised to stop the buffalo hunters who were decimating the large herds on the plains, under the condition that the Comanche, along with the Apache, Kiowa, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, would leave their land. But the government did not stop the slaughter of herds, and the Comanche fought back by attacking a hunting party in Texas. This conflict became known as the Second Battle of Adobe Walls. The attack was a disaster for the Comanche, and the United States Army was called in during the Red River War to suppress the remaining Comanche in the area, forcefully removing them to the Indian reservation. In just 10 years, the buffalo were on the brink of extinction, essentially ending the Comanche way of life as hunters. In May 1875, the last free Comanche group surrendered and moved to the Fort Sill Reservation in Oklahoma. The 1890 census revealed that there are only 1598 Comanche on the Fort Sill Reservation. During World War II, many Comanche left the traditional tribal lands in Oklahoma looking for jobs and further opportunities in the Californian cities. About half of the Comanche population still lives in Oklahoma, with the rest scattered throughout Texas, California, and New Mexico. These days, many Comanches from all of the United States meet in annual gatherings to celebrate their heritage and culture. Cheyenne are Native American tribes that speak a language of Algonquian origin that was widely used by different tribes from the east coast of North America to the Rocky Mountains. They were intimately connected with other tribes such as the Arapaho and the Gros Ventre, fostering connections with the Lakota Sioux. The Cheyenne were among the most prominent tribes of the plains, living and hunting mainly in the hills and prairies along the Missouri and Red Rivers. They called themselves Tesistists, a name which is translated in many different ways and may mean equal people or our people. Originally, the Cheyenne lived in the Great Lakes area of Minnesota and on the Missouri River, where they homesteaded in earth-covered log houses in permanent settlements, cultivated corn and pumpkins, hunted wild animals, harvested wild rice, and made pottery. By the late 1600s, however, they began a westward migration, most likely due to competition and conflict with the Ojibwe, Arikara, and Mandan Indians. As migrating to the southwest, their lifestyle shifted to that of nomadic hunters and gatherers. In the 1700s, the Cheyenne took over Horses brought by the Spanish and became skilled buffalo hunters, nevertheless conflicts against their Sioux enemies eventually pushed the Cheyenne further into the plains, who in turn pushed the Kiowas tribe further south. In 1832 the Cheyenne broke up into two groups, one inhabiting the Platte River near the Black Hills and the other living near the Arkansas River further south in Colorado. Those who relocated to the Arkansas River eventually came into contact with the Kiowas and their Comanche allies. Several fierce battles occurred between them until 1840, at which time an alliance was formed with the Kiowa, Apache, and Comanche tribes under the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. The first Cheyenne territory was established in northern Colorado, comprising the present-day sites of Fort Collins, Denver, and Colorado Springs. A signed peace treaty with the Kiowas allowed the Cheyenne to expand their forays further south. In 1853 they conducted their first raid into Mexico, with dire results, having lost most of their warriors in a battle with the Mexicans as further European and American settlers pushed westward. In the 1850s the Cheyenne, along with their new allies, soon began to rebel against the pioneers as well as the United States Army. Upon the discovery of gold in Colorado, the 1851 treaty was breached, and the territory which had been given to the Cheyenne was taken away. A few Cheyenne warriors raided at least three groups of emigrant settlers. A combined army of 400 American soldiers headed east across the plains in search of the Cheyenne to punish them for their crimes. Influenced by a healer named White Bull, the Cheyenne took to the battle, believing spiritual medicine would prevent the American soldiers' guns from firing. The Cheyenne encircled the approaching troops as they follow near the Solomon River. American officer Edwin Sumner commandeered a cavalry charge, and the troops charged forward with drawn sabers while the Cheyenne were forced to flee. It was the first battle that the Cheyenne fought against the United States Army. The American troops pressed on and 2 days later burned a Cheyenne camp and obliterated the living quarters and the winter supply of buffalo meat. This prompted what became known as the Colorado War of 1864 to 1865. The Cheyenne people were forced to move to a reservation in Oklahoma, where yet another conflict took place in the early morning hours of November 27, 1868. After experiencing a number of miscommunications, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer led the 7th United States Cavalry in a raid on a peaceful Cheyenne encampment. Native revenge was to come during the Battle of Little Bighorn on June 25, 1876, when the Cheyenne, along with the Lakota Sioux and a small band of Arapaho, wiped out the army of George Custer, who was also killed during the conflict. The battle became known as the greatest victory of the Native American Indians, as 262 soldiers died in the battle, while only about 60 Indian warriors were killed following the Battle of Little Bighorn. There were further efforts to force the Cheyenne onto a reservation in Indian Territory. In 1877, nearly 1,000 northern Cheyenne were forcibly marched to Oklahoma, where they found conditions appalling, with many falling ill and dying of malaria. Unable to adjust to the hot climate, the northern Cheyenne fled back north, led by Chief Blind Knife and Little Wolf in 1878. In 1884, an executive order created a reservation for the northern Cheyenne in southeastern Montana. These days, the Cheyenne hold two reservations, one in Tongue River, Montana, where about 6,500 people reside. The other reservation in southwestern Oklahoma consists of about 11,000 members and shared with their longtime allies, the Arapaho allies, who for decades have fought together for the right to keep their way of life. The North American indigenous nations and tribes played a key role in the United States founding history, while many indigenous cultures took a significant part during the period of colonization of the Wild West. Few can claim to play as an important part as the Apache Indians. The Apache Indians were rabid warriors who refused to give up their land despite the mounting odds against them. The Apaches are a group of culturally Related Native American tribes in the southwestern United States, they are distant relatives of the Navajo, with whom they share the Athabascan languages spoken throughout the western United States. Historically, the Apache homelands contained areas that now correspond to eastern Arizona, northern Mexico, New Mexico, western Texas, and southern Colorado. These areas are known collectively as Apache. The early Apaches were a nomadic people covering a wide area of the United States. Wandering as far south as Mexico, they were primarily hunters and gatherers, with some groups hunting buffalo and others engaging in limited farming. The Apache lived in two kinds of traditional homes, the wickiups and teepees. The wickiup was more of a permanent home, its frame made of tree saplings, forming a dome covered with bark or grass. The tents, called teepees, were a temporary home that could easily be relocated when the tribe needed to move around to hunt buffalo, to haul their tents and other items. When they moved, the Apache used a type of sled called a travois that could be filled with items and then pulled along by dogs. When the Europeans brought horses to the Americas, the Apache started using horses to drag the travois. Since horses were much bigger and stronger, the travois could be larger and carry many more belongings. This also allowed the Apaches to make bigger tents. Traditionally, the warriors did not wear feathered warfare headdresses, although the Plains Apaches adopted their headdresses from there. Iroquois friends. Most Apache tribes wore leather or cloth tiaras. Apache people used to wear wooden masks and special headdresses for religious ceremonies. The face paint would depend on the sort of ceremony, and they would differ if they were going into battle. Whenever a tribal chief was chosen, it was done democratically. The Apaches' decision to choose their leadership was based on respect for each candidate. If the candidate did not enjoy the respect of many in the tribe, he would lose his position. For the Apache, a strong trust of the tribe's members and their leader was important. The Apache tribes have a steep history of fighting for their territory. They fought against the Spanish and Mexican invaders during the 17th century and the Americans during the 19th century. The bravery of these indigenous warriors are mirrored in the very name by which they are called. The term Apache probably comes from the word Apache, which means enemy in the Zuni language of the indigenous people who lived west of New Mexico. When the horse and gun trade concentrated in the Central Plains around 1750, Indian raids by formerly nomadic groups such as the Comanche increased significantly. The Apaches who lived on the plains were severely pressured by the Comanche and had to retreat to the south and west. Eventually, these displaced Apaches escalated their raids against other Indians and settlers for food and livestock. Apache raids against settlers and migrants crossing their land continued during the westward expansion period of the United States and the acquisition of New Mexico by the United States in 1848. There were three Apache tribes that stood out: the Iroquois tribe, the Jicarilla tribe, and the Mescalero tribe. The Kakrruk were the Apaches of the Great Mountain, named so after their ancient home in the foothills of southeastern Arizona. They were the most pugnacious of the Arizona Indians. Their raids extended into New Mexico, southern Arizona, and northern Sonora, Mexico. Some of the most notable leaders were Cochise Nice and Geronimo. The Jicarilla were one of 6 groups that migrated out of Canada between about 1300 and 1500 AD. Heading south, they settled in the southwest, where their traditional homeland cover more than 50 million acres in northern New Mexico, southern Colorado, and western Oklahoma. The Mescalero were one of the most vicious Apache groups in the Southwest. When defending their homeland, nomadic hunters and warriors, they moved from place to place, riding their Waikibes in Texas, Arizona, and Mexico between 1700 and 1750. Many Mescalero groups were dislodged from the southern plains in central Texas by their Comanche enemies. By this time, they had taken refuge in the mountains of New Mexico, West Texas, and Mexico. In the late 1800s, the Apache fought multiple battles against the United States government. They were trying to fight back against the aggression and conquest of their lands. Several great Apache leaders came into being, such as Cochise and Geronimo. They fought with ferocity for decades, but ultimately had to surrender and were forced to set up reservations in 1849. Gold was discovered in San Francisco, leading to the California gold rush. Many American citizens living in the East began to migrate to California. As a result, they would often cross in and out of Apache lands. The tense relationship between the Apaches and the Americans began to turn hostile. These became known as the Apache Wars when the American Civil War broke out between 1861 and 1865. The westward migration flow was curtailed, however, the Apaches continued to defend their land. They did not choose a side and fought against the Union and Confederate Army because they believed they were encroaching on their land. After the war, the United States breached several treaties they had with the Apaches and continued to drive them off their land. This heralded the beginning of many years of clashes between the United States military forces in the southwestern Native peoples. The root causes of the conflict included the Apaches' unwillingness to live on the Indian reservations created by the U.S. government. They were also related to the expansion of gold, silver, and coal mining operations in the Apache territories. The last of the Apache Wars ended in 1886. With the surrender of Apache chief Geronimo and his few remaining followers, the Iroquois tribe was evicted from the West and held as prisoners of war for 27 years in Florida, Alabama, and Fort Sill, Oklahoma. In 1913, members of the tribe were given the option of taking land plots in Oklahoma or living in New Mexico on the Mescalera Reservation. In a 2000 cultural census carried out in the United States, about 57,000 people identified themselves solely as Apache. Another 40,000 people reported being part Apache. Today, many Apaches live on reservations in Arizona and New Mexico. Farming, ranching, and tourism-related businesses are significant economic activities for these people. Although they live in modern times, they still keep their ancestral beliefs and traditions alive. Foreign